So tonight we are discussing the topic of overcoming addictions. And this is a subject that is familiar to many of us. We know a lot of people around us who deal with addictions, and we may have dealt with some addictions ourselves, could even still be struggling with some addictions. But we want to talk about how God can help us with that, where He comes into the middle of that, where prayer can help. But first of all, we're going to talk about addictions and what they are. So the definition of an addiction, according to the dictionary, is the state of being enslaved to a habit or practice or to something that is psychologically or physically habit-forming, as narcotics, to such an extent that its cessation causes severe trauma. So essentially what the dictionary definition is saying there is that you become controlled by a particular habit, by a particular substance perhaps, and that enslaves you. You're bound by it. And if you try to stop it, it actually causes you trauma. This is one of the reasons why people keep cycling back into addictions, because addictions have been used to help them in some way or whatever, but it actually causes stress and trauma to stop. It's also one of the reasons why if somebody's under an extreme amount of stress and they are already addicted to a substance, for example, if they've been addicted to something, like they've been smoking something or they've been even drinking a little bit, I don't really say, you know what, you better stop the addictive behavior right now unless it's actually immediately physically harming to them, dangerous to their health, their well-being, their life, because it's going to add extra stress. So I've said to people, for example, you know what, get through this period of time, what you're dealing with, this particular type of stress, for a month or so. Don't worry about trying to quit smoking in the middle of this. Afterwards, quit smoking. And usually then there's success. Whereas if somebody tries to do all of it at once and deal with all the issues at once, it isn't very successful because, well, it ends up adding trauma to the situation. But just because it adds trauma doesn't mean that it's necessarily good to continue it. The reason it's adding trauma is because there's some dependency on that particular thing, and to separate yourself from it creates stress. But if you kept on with it, it would create more trauma and more distress, because it's actually harmful to continue with an addiction in the way that it is. So people can be addicted to a lot of different things, not just alcohol or drugs. That's what we commonly think of, is that if somebody's addicted, they're going to be addicted to alcohol or drugs. But people can be addicted to basically anything. People can be addicted to food. They can be addicted to work. That's why we have the term workaholic. They could be addicted to television, to the internet, to pornography. They could even be addicted to people in relationships. Usually a relational addiction, we tend to call it codependency, where a person has to either have you all the time, you know, it's all or nothing. You either are with me, you love me, you're with me, we're good, or if you do something I don't like, or you're with somebody else, or you're spending time somewhere else, then, well, I guess you don't want to be my friend at all anymore. And it kind of bounces back and forth. And people end up holding each other into relationships in an unhealthy manner, a relationship that ends up being based on fear of losing that person instead of on love, and building a healthy relationship with healthy boundaries and healthy balance. So people, even people in relationships, can become an addiction. Addictions have both a psychological or mind aspect and a physical or body aspect. Often there can be a generational aspect as well, as those beliefs and those physical tendencies tend to be passed down. Those patterns of behavior, the patterns of thinking, the ways of coping and handling things tend to be passed down. There are common beliefs and structures that drive the addiction and keep it in place. And that seems to be the case regardless of what the addiction is. So you could have somebody who grew up in a family of alcoholics, never touched a drop, but still they have this sort of addictive, we sometimes tend to call it an addictive personality. It's not really a personality. It's tendencies. And that addictive tendency is actually a series of beliefs and patterns and ways of looking at life and ways of coping that surround a sort of what we would call an addictive pattern. And what that usually is, it's a pattern of avoidance of pain. Now, none of us like pain. We don't like to have to deal with it. But with an addiction, it's a drive to stay away from pain at all costs and to use something else to cover that and to help them through it rather than have to face the pain of, well, facing it or the pain of the situation itself. They'll go with addictions to try and help them and to cover up and to cope with those stresses. So the common beliefs around addictions tend to be around the idea of not being able to cope with the stresses of life without the help of this substance, without the help of alcohol. I've got to have a drink or I can't cope with stress. Or I've got to have that particular substance or I can't cope with stress. Or one thing I've heard a lot of in the midst of the COVID pandemic, I have just binge-watched Netflix all day long. I can't cope with the stress of what's going on right now. It could be anything. But the idea there is just I can't cope, and so therefore I'm going to distract to this other thing that doesn't really help me with coping. It just keeps me in a state in which I don't have to feel the pain and I don't have to face it. So the common structure around addictive patterns is this tendency to avoid rather than to face the difficulties of life. And so skills to face the difficulties in life often aren't developed. And that's one of the reasons also why it gets passed on in generations, because parents are supposed to teach their kids life skills. But if a parent has an addiction or there's been an addictive pattern, they may tend not to have those life skills themselves. They may tend to go towards avoidance or to not face difficulties and not develop those skills themselves, so they don't teach their kids that. And if they're in the midst of an addiction themselves, they're not coping and they're drunk or whatever it might be, then their kids are not learning how to cope either. What they're getting modeled is how to avoid. And so they start to avoid too, and it's automatic. And then the next generation starts to get into various addictions as well. Don't get discouraged with that, though, because there is a way to change those patterns. Those chains can be broken. So that's on the emotional and the mental side. There's also a physical dependency on the substance that is so significant that often there are strong, uncomfortable physical symptoms when one attempts to stop using the substance. And that can actually be a deterrent to quitting. And to the it can be a deterrent to quitting it, and it can be a motivation to quit the process of quitting. There can also be a physical urge to return to using the addictive substance again. And this can be more pronounced and more difficult to resist if the underlying beliefs have not been addressed. Now, there's an actual physical draw towards it because our bodies get used to being able to identify what we need or what our bodies think we need. So when we are thirsty, we want water, You know, our bodies feel it and we go and get ourselves a drink of water. But if our body thinks that it needs a particular substance, whether it was food, alcohol, drugs, it needs to sit down right now and watch TV, whatever it might be, the body literally will crave it. And so your body is pulling you to do that. And if your body has become used to at some point, let's say you quit an addiction, but your body became used to at some point giving into that addiction, when you get into that similar sort of stressful situation, you feel the pull to go back to that addiction. If you've been addressing your issues, if you've been healing from stuff that's gone on that you were not facing before, if you've stopped with some of that avoidance and you've actually been addressing some of your issues, it becomes easier and easier to resist that urge because you have other tools now. And that pain isn't quite as severe because you've been healing in some of those areas. And so there's not quite as much of a pull then to have to go back to the addiction, even though you still may get some urges, and you've got more ability to resist it. So how do we address the faulty beliefs? Well, the first step is we've got to recognize them. How do we recognize the difference between a faulty belief and a true one? Well, true beliefs can be backed up with evidence that actually proves them. Now, that's really, really important to note there. It's not just evidence, because our minds come up with all sorts of evidence. You know, that person didn't speak to me. I think they hate me. Okay, well, the evidence is there that they didn't speak to you. But the meaning of that doesn't necessarily, just because they didn't speak to you, doesn't necessarily mean that they hated you. So our mind draws inferences. It draws conclusions, and we've got to make sure that the conclusion that we're drawing actually fits the evidence. So true beliefs will have evidence, and the evidence will actually prove the belief that we have. Now, a true belief in the situation where somebody didn't speak to you, that person didn't speak to me. They usually do. Something's different. Maybe something's wrong, but I don't know what's going on. Maybe I should speak to them and find out what's happening. Might be a better belief to be following. Maybe I need to reach out to them. Maybe I need to just presume that I don't know what's going on and I don't have to know. I could pray for them. Or I could wait for them to talk to me, but I don't have to presume that they don't like me because they didn't speak to me. So we can have a more realistic belief and a more rational belief about the things of life. Okay? If you had a belief that said, I can't stand things, I can't handle it, it's too much, okay? Where's the evidence? Well, the evidence is you're going through some stress. Certainly you are. But does the evidence prove you can't stand it? The interesting thing about people saying they can't stand something is that usually when you're saying it, you're right in the middle of that event, whatever it is, and you actually are standing it. You may be struggling, you may be hurting, you may be feeling like you're in a lot of distress, but you haven't died yet. You are actually surviving. You can actually stand it, and you're proving it by the fact that you're still standing. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't deal with anything, that you should just, suck it up and put up. That isn't what that means at all. It means that it can give you encouragement and hope to realize that you actually have strength to be able to face it rather than have to run from it or avoid it like addictive patterns would tell you to do. So then you can start to problem solve. I am standing it now. I don't want this stress to continue forever, so what can I do to help resolve this problem? or to help me to cope and get through it and to deal with it while I'm in it, instead of what can I do to get out of it. It's what can I do to get through it. And there's a very big difference between getting through something and just getting out of it. We get out of it when we get through it. But sometimes getting out of it means I just want to escape. And the thing is, when we come back to it, it's still going to be there. So somewhere along the line, we need to be able to face it, go through it, and be able to then get out of it and actually be able to leave it behind us then, so that it no longer detrimentally controls our lives. If we have a belief that something is going to be or has been or will be an absolute and complete disaster, then that's usually a little bit extreme, if not a lot extreme. As I work in the area around Bruce Power, I've often had workers from Bruce Power come to see me for counseling. And if they're dealing with some degree of anxiety and stress and feeling overwhelmed, a lot of times this belief of it's going to be a disaster, it's terrible, I can't cope, it comes through very quickly and very clearly. I can't handle this. Maybe it's my job I can't handle. Maybe it's my family I can't handle. Maybe it's this I can't handle or that I can't handle. And one of the things that I've pointed out is, you know, you guys work in the nuclear industry. And of course, if they work in the nuclear industry, they can tell me what all sorts of checks and balances that are in that place to make sure that it doesn't turn into a disaster and they don't blow themselves and everybody else up. And yet, the level of catastrophe can sometimes be almost at the level of, if I don't, or if this situation doesn't turn out the way that I want it to, it's just going to completely ruin and destroy everything. And I have often made the comment, well, you know what? We are all still standing. The nuclear power plant did not blow up. So I guess we don't have disaster quite yet. And it often puts things in perspective. So to understand how to change that is we need to have a realistic viewpoint of life. A realistic viewpoint of the situation at hand, rather than taking it into an extreme disaster. And one helpful exercise sometimes to do is to just face it and take a look at it and say, okay, how big of a deal am I making of this? Am I treating it like it is a nuclear disaster? But that would be like, you know, everybody dies around us entirely. Well, it's not at that level. It may still be bad. There could be a lot of people getting sick, for example. But how big of a disaster is it really? You know, in our time that we live in right now, this is something that's very key because the disaster scenarios are being promoted all around us. And some disaster scenarios may even be somewhat realistic, while other things that are being spoken of take it to a level that's unrealistic. And people, meanwhile, listening to all of this, can start to panic. Even as our province and our country is starting to open up, people are still very afraid to come out because they're afraid that there's going to be a terrible disaster if they come out. And yet, realistically, yes, this pandemic is bad. Yes, it's killing people. Yes, we need to take precautions. But we need to also not be afraid. We need to be confident that as we take those precautions, we have given ourselves and those around us the best possibility of being able to survive this. So, that's a little bit different than thinking, does everybody around me? Everybody around me might. I think everybody around me does. Potentially, I've got to treat them all as if they're going to infect me and everybody else. No. We need to be aware that potentially they do, but that doesn't mean they do have that problem any more than we do. Maybe they've stayed in their house for the last 2 weeks too, and they don't have any chance of passing it on because they never caught it. So we need to have a balanced view. Yes, take the precautions. Don't panic. Don't turn it into a disaster that's bigger than the disaster is. It's already big enough as it is. A lot of people are getting into more addictions at this point in time because, you know what, I think I'll just hide in my addiction so I don't have to face what's going on in the world, and I don't have to face what's going on in my life now, which is accentuated because of what's going on in the world. And so we want to be able to address the underlying mindsets that people have, and particularly, we need to be able to address them in ourselves. One very key thing there is that we don't give in to all or nothing thinking. That's what we call globalizing things. Things are not all one way or all another way. Usually, they're a little bit of both in the world that we live in. And so we need to find that balance realistically. And again, the evidence will show. But there's also another way, and that is that we need to have logical thinking. And logical thinking works this way. If A is true, then B is true. It has to actually follow through that that is actually a true statement. So, for example, in my first example that I gave, if someone doesn't speak to me, then what am I going to presume from that? Well, if I presume they don't like me, then logically, A, the fact that they didn't speak to me, would need to mean automatically B, that they don't like me. But how many other reasons are there that somebody might not speak to you? Quite a lot. They might not have seen you. They might have laryngitis. They might be having a bad day. It might be nothing about you whatsoever. And so logically, it doesn't follow that because somebody didn't speak to you, that therefore they don't like you. You'd have to have a little bit more evidence. There'd have to be a little bit more to cover things to make that statement actually be logical. So if you want to test to see if you're thinking rationally, if you're thinking logically, do a little test on your thinking. When I've concluded, if this happens, then this happens, does it automatically have to happen that way? If there is even one exception to that rule, it's not logical. And we need to get back in line with the truth. The third way we can test things to see whether our beliefs are in line with the truth is what outcome it brings. Does it bring an outcome of life, of godliness, of love, of peace? True peace, that is, not just smoothing things over and avoiding. If what I'm believing brings me love, joy, peace, if it demonstrates the fruit of the Spirit, and that is manifested in my life, if it brings life, if it's life-giving, then it's likely to be true. But if it brings the opposite of what Jesus said, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy, If it brings something that steals, that kills, and destroys, then it's not based in truth, and we may need to change it. And there are various ways that we can do that. A therapy can help with that, with changing those beliefs. And there's a whole process of things that you can learn in regards to how to do that, and we call it cognitive behavioral therapy. There's a number of other processes that can be done, and one of the processes that can be done is prayer ministry. And that can be very helpful, because what do we do in prayer ministry? In inner healing prayer, what we do is we bring the underlying beliefs to Jesus. We bring the issue to Jesus, and we ask him to reveal what those underlying beliefs are. Jesus, is there any lies that I've believed? And we confess that. If there's anything that comes to mind, we confess that and say, and ask him to forgive us. And we declare our dependency on God, not our dependency on an addictive substance or action, but that God is the one who can carry us through and can protect us where protection really is needed, but also can help us to face and give us the strength to deal with the issues of life. And we trust him to enable us to walk in the truth. Because then we ask him, Lord, what's the truth to replace those lies? And we listen to him, and we receive his truth. So let's say we took my example of the person walking down the street, and they didn't talk to me, and I feel rejected, and I think they don't like me. If I take that to Jesus and I say, Jesus, this person walked down the street, and they didn't even acknowledge that I was alive. And I thought they were my friend, and I'm feeling very hurt by this. Jesus, is there any lies I've believed? He may reveal that one of the lies is that they don't like you. Is you don't know what the attitude of their heart is. You cannot read their mind. And if you said, Jesus, what's the truth? He may reveal to you that the truth is that you are loved, and that there are lots of people who like you, and most of all that he loves you, and no matter who doesn't like you, he will always be with you. And when you receive that truth and you begin to live by it, it can be very freeing. Now, do you need to avoid or go into any sort of addiction to deal with the pain of feeling rejected? No, because Jesus has filled that place, and you are accepted and you are loved. And you can now face life from the perspective of that love. So healing prayer can be that's just one example. And of course, anybody who's gone through it, you know there's been times where you've been set free, and there's a freedom and there's a peace that comes from just getting that insight from the Lord Jesus and being able to lay to rest some things that have been bothering you and receive the truth and have that peace and that hope and that joy again restored. Or perhaps even brought into your life in a way you never experienced before. And that process can be very helpful in assisting people to overcome addictions as well, and to heal from the wounds that they used the addiction to medicate to keep them from having to face in the first place. One other process that kind of actually really fits in with the prayer process very well is a process that we all know if we have dealt with addictions at all. Most addiction treatment programs that exist today are based off this process. And it's called the 12 Steps. It comes from Alcoholics Anonymous. What's very interesting about the 12 Steps and how they were developed is that they were developed by Christians. Originally, they were developed by a group called the Oxford Group, and the Oxford Group was very influential in the lives of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous. And they took those principles and they put them into the 12 steps. They created them into the 12 steps. But those 12 steps are basically a process that is very biblical, and that the Word of God actually teaches about spiritual growth, about personal growth, about healing, about transformation of people's lives. It actually works for all of those things. And it turns us to face God and as the one who can help us to overcome whatever we may be addicted to. And so when we go through the 12 steps, we can see this. Step number 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol or over whatever substance or addiction it may be, that our lives had become unmanageable. But what do we need to do, first of all, as human beings, when we come to Christ, is we need to recognize that we need to come to the end of ourselves. We need to recognize that our own self-efforts do not actually cut it to fully help us to overcome and to be all that we are meant to be. We are powerless in that sense. Doesn't mean we can't do anything at all about anything. It means that we cannot overcome sin entirely. We cannot overcome addictions entirely by our own self-efforts. We just can't. Because we cannot be perfect. We cannot succeed all the time. There's only one who can, and that's God. And so we need His strength to help us even in the midst of the struggles we have so that we can overcome. Because it takes strength that's greater than ours. Which leads us to step number 2. I came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And then to number 3. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. Isn't that the exact process that we go through when we receive Christ? I give myself to you, and I receive what you have for me, Jesus. I give up my own self-effort, and I receive what you did on the cross for me for salvation. And as we walk in that, it's a continual walk of doing that, of saying, no, it's not me, my will, that makes this happen. It's me submitting to God and His will. But then there's a certain walk that we have as He gives us the strength. And really those 3 steps are the steps that give us the strength to do the rest of the steps. Step number 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. That's tough. It means being humble. It means facing the struggles. It means acknowledging where I have messed up and not making excuses for it and not avoiding it. And that is a step that is carried out over and over again in our lives as we grow. It happens in layers. And the step following is admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being, the exact nature of our wrongs. The Word of God says, if we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That's the admitting of them to God. God, I admit I failed. And then receiving His forgiveness is the solution for that. Being accountable to others is very important as well, so that we can help each other along this journey. Step number 6, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. That's another tough one because, again, it takes humility to say, I have problems, and I'm willing to let go of those problems and let God take them and give me something better. And then, before we can actually do step 7, we have to have step 6. We have to become ready and willing. And then step 7 is humbly ask Him to remove our shortcomings. And that's as simple as a prayer. God, take this. And then step 8 is made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. That isn't making amends yet. It's just being willing to. It's recognizing that I have hurt people by some things I've done, and I'm willing to go and say to them, I'm sorry I messed up. And is there anything I can do to make this right? To find out what there is, if there is anything you can do to make it right. But you're not doing it yet. You need to just become willing first and be able to identify who you would need to approach. Step 9 is making direct amends to such people whenever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. There are times when you would not go to somebody and say, hey, I'm sorry. Because it might actually stir up some stuff with them that would cause more problems, or it could cause harm to actually step back into their lives. You can still confess it to God, and you can still ask God to bless those people. But this is, again, about not avoiding anymore. It's about facing up to what you've done and correcting it where you can, and being able to also release it to God where you can't. Step 10, 11, and 12 are actually a continuation of just deepening this walk. Step 10, continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. Step 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us and the power to carry that out. And step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics, or in the case of any addiction, to other addicts, and to practice these principles in all of our affairs. So it becomes a lifestyle. And everybody's at a different stage in that lifestyle, and everybody is accepted, regardless of which stage you're at, regardless of which step you can or cannot perform. Because it's not about performance. It's about a journey, and it's about growth. It's about transformation. And at the core of it all, it is God, that power higher than ourselves, who is actually doing that in and with us as we partner with Him in the process of overcoming whatever the addiction may be that we struggle with, or whatever the issue may be that we struggle with that may have had us enslaved and ensnared. And as we release that to God and allow Him to help us to overcome that and the effects of it, we can step into greater and greater freedom, greater and greater ability to overcome, and greater ability also to assist others in their journey of overcoming as well.